My name is Miriam Moore. I'm from the University of North Georgia in Gainesville, Georgia in the United States. This presentation is entitled, No, It's Not Obvious, Pedagogical Insights from SFL-Oriented Feedback Analysis. In this talk, I will look at my effort to apply the attitude system within the appraisal framework to written feedback. I will focus specifically on coding challenges, preliminary findings, pedagogical implications, and efforts to refocus the project more productively going forward. The study began as part of a project designed to interrogate what one might call entrenched feedback practices from a college writing instructor with nearly 30 years of experience teaching first-year composition in the United States. Informed by Yancey, Robertson, and Taxak's Teaching for Transfer model, this instructor, who happens to be me, wanted to look at her written feedback with fresh eyes to discover syntactic and rhetorical features that characterize that feedback and ultimately discover barriers or challenges that these features might impose for students' uptake and application of the feedback. In other words, this study is designed to uncover assumptions and points of confusion embedded in my written responses to student writing. I have used two separate frameworks for analysis: legitimation code theory, specifically the specialization dimension, and an SFL-oriented analysis based on mood and appraisal. I'm reporting only on the SFL study here, for which I asked two questions. What does attitude look like in my written feedback? And does syntactic mood correlate with the realization of appraisal in my feedback, and if so, how? Obviously, written feedback can be broadly characterized as evaluative in nature, whether it is summative or formative, sometimes couched in praise or sugaring the pill, as Highland and Highland 2001 called it, or whether facilitative or directive in nature. These are terms defined by Richard Straub in 1996. The goal of feedback is, presumably, to provide information students can use to improve the work at hand and build transferable knowledge and skills to carry to future writing context. Giving them this information entails evaluation, or what Martin 2000 and Martin and White 2005 have termed appraisal. But what exactly does that look like in my own feedback? And critically, is that appraisal presented to students in ways that will be clear and useful to them? To study this, I collected written feedback on 105 draft assignments submitted to me during the spring of 2019. I did not, in this instance, collect or try to measure what students did with the feedback. Rather, I was interested in the feedback itself as a text. The comments were made on drafts of a literacy narrative and short paragraphs that were building towards a research paper. Each assignment could be revised potentially multiple times prior to final submission for a grade, so the feedback is definitely formative in nature. The comments were delivered via the comments feature on Google Docs, which aligns a boxed comment with a highlighted portion of a student draft. A sample such comment appears on this screen. In sum, there were 969 such comments, with 3,372 clauses and over 22,000 words. Ranking clauses were subsequently coded for mood, modalization, which focuses on the decline of probability or usuality, as well as modulation, focusing on what Halliday and Matheson termed the scale of obligation and inclination. Following the analysis of clausal mood, however, organizing the feedback for additional analysis proved to be a challenge. Would a comment, as defined by these boxes in Google Docs, serve as a unit for analysis? Should I assume that Google-based comments would be analogous to traditional written paper comments, where there is an in-text commentary aligned to portions of the text and an ultimate summative comment called the end comment at the end of the document? It was obvious that my use of the Google comment was not analogous to handwritten feedback. I realized quickly I had not been consistent in the highlighting and presentation of my comments. Specifically, the relationship between what was highlighted, a sentence, multiple sentences, words, or parts of words, was not necessarily consistent, as you can see on this slide. Also, multiple comments might not be visible all at once, as similarly on this slide, where the comment addresses only what was highlighted with the word states. Other comments are difficult to see. Some in-text comments address both what was highlighted as well as broader concerns about the paper, again, as in this example comment. And comments addressing an entire paragraph might be associated with text at the beginning or end of that paragraph. It was not consistent. And box comments, which I counted as my end or summative comments, were aligned in different places as well. Some attached to the title, the student's name, the first line of the paper, or even the final line of the paper. It was clear, therefore, even before beginning the analysis of appraisal, that I had identified several barriers for students in reading and sense-making when it came to my feedback. Students might not know how to find the overall evaluation of their assignments within the Google Docs. The presentation of multiple comments at once in the single layout of the screen could be difficult, and it was not always easy to connect highlighted segments of the text to the associated comments given the layout of the page. Also given the fact that many of my students are working with smaller tablets or even their cell phones to review comments. Finding summative comments could also be difficult. Clearly, reading Google comments is not straightforward, even when the feedback is consistent, and mine clearly was not. In terms of pedagogy, before I even started my analysis, I realized I needed to adjust strategy and provide additional coaching for my students. Ultimately, however, for this analysis, I decided to use thematically related segments within a single Google comment as the basis for the appraisal analysis. The segments ranged from a single elliptical clause to a full paragraph, and they were classified according to focus: content, language, text, or summative. Having organized this relatively large amount of data for analysis, I turned to the attitude system within Martin and White's appraisal framework, which I modified as follows. Tokens of affect focus on the experience of the reader, whether this is myself as the instructor or an imagined reader, whom I often introduce to students as your reader. In tokens of judgment, the object of evaluation is the student writer, and the extent to which that student has exhibited the behaviors and skills one would associate with a college writer. These comments may also foreground the student's honesty and accuracy in presenting their arguments and information, and their ability to avoid plagiarism. Finally, tokens of appreciation, the object of evaluation is the developing text itself, the impact on readers, composition, and its value. Here I should note that I added a label within the subcategory of composition to address specifically the extent to which the developing text adheres to academic standards for formatting, citation, grammar, and mechanics, as well as assignment requirements. Within appreciation, balance concerns the sense of proportion, coherence, and completeness of the text, while complexity is concerned with issues of clarity and cohesion. The subcategories within valuation, in contrast, relate to the construction of arguments and the use of supporting sources. Initial coding for many comments was straightforward, particularly when there were clearly inscribed tokens of attitude, as seen here. For example, consider these tokens of affect appraisal. I really like the way you're putting this together, Joe, where Joe is a pseudonym. This is an inscribed token of positive happiness. And I'm afraid I don't understand here, an inscribed token of negative satisfaction. For appreciation, words such as strong and lovely are inscribed tokens of positive quality, while unorthodox in the next example is an inscribed token of negative quality. In addition, many polar interrogatives were easily coded as invoked tokens of negative appreciation. Here, a lack of balance because of missing information. And then finally, in terms of judgment, there are some clear tokens of positive esteem, such as these examples of positive capacity and tenacity. But not all coding was that straightforward and simple. I encountered challenges quickly, not the least of which was the time and the practical constraints of coding 969 comments. Beyond the sheer size of the data for an appraisal analysis, there were instances in which a single comment, even a single clause, could be coded in multiple ways, similar to challenges outlined in Thompson 2014 and McInerney and Isaac 2014. For example, there are at least two possible ways to code the following. Also remember that you need a DOI or a URL for a database source. Clearly, the draft lacked required information in its list of works cited, and as such, this is a token of negative appreciation, specifically a negative composition statement in relation to standards. But SFLIG 2022 codes similar imperatives as instances of judgment, noting that the directive could be seen as an invoked token of negative esteem, specifically negative tenacity. The student who did not remember to include expected information is deemed, in that case, the object of the appraisal. Similarly, consider the following comment. Did any of the material in these paragraphs come from sources? Make sure you include that information. There are at least 4 possible ways to code this comment. 2 involve appreciation. The text does not properly address sources and could thus be considered an example of a negative propriety. Also, the text is not clear about its source information. This could be considered negative complexity within appreciation. But also, the question and the following imperative could be considered statements of negative judgment. The student who has not done what writers should do could be evaluated as negative tenacity, or the student may have possibly been dishonest here about source use. This would be an instance of negative propriety in terms of a sanction in judgment. We might further suggest that appreciation is implied in the polar interrogative, while judgment is implied in the following directive. For coding, should I split this single comment and code each clause separately, even though they are clearly related to the same issue in the draft? In his discussion of such challenges, Thompson 2014 points back to what Martin and White have called decline of instantiation, recognizing that different analyses have different focal levels. Some capture meaning potential at the systemic level of the language, appraisal as a whole, while others focus more narrowly on realizations of such potentials in the reading of a particular text type or even a particular instance of a text. So here I am focused on patterns of appraisal in my own feedback, a very specific instantiation. I can look at other examples of appraisal analysis as helpful to discern how appraisal resources are typically used in feedback, as in the SFLIG 2022 or Cunningham and Link 2021 sources, but I need to recognize that appraisal as instantiated in my feedback and in my context within the United States may actually differ. So on this point, consider the following directives, each of which could be construed as both negative appreciation, a focus on the developing text, or negative judgment, tenacity, specifically, the writer's failure to do what is expected. The word expected is critical. If the problem in the text has been covered in class and students were expected to demonstrate mastery or familiarity of that concept in the context of the draft, coding as a token of negative esteem makes sense. If, on the other hand, the directive is a reminder of a logical next step or a pointing out of a less familiar concept and skill, it is more difficult to read these directives as realizations of judgment and more likely instantiations of negative appreciation. The first 2 items here, in fact, do point to concepts that had been repeatedly emphasized in my class and had been practiced in prior assignments. They are backwards looking, reminding students of what is expected and what they did not do. They could be considered negative judgment. The remaining 4 directives address issues that had been more recently introduced. Students would not have been expected to have mastered them or focused on them in these early drafts. They are more forward-looking. They are reminders of what needs to be done before assignments can be considered complete. As a result, I would more likely code these as negative appreciation. Coding is further complicated by the fact that the binary choice inscribed or invoked does not capture fully the range of ways in which particular issues are addressed. There can be a clearly inscribed reference to a problem, as in the first example here, a problem with clarity, but that could also be clearly invoked through a question. Could you clarify? Other questions point out 2 possible readings, again suggesting clearly that there is a problem in clarity, but that clarity is not named. And finally, you can have invoked problems with with appreciation that are actually written as statements of affect, such as in, I am confused. Given the size of the data set that I have been working with, I decided to follow the advice of Thompson that wording should be taken as the basis for the initial assignment of categories, which he notes means taking the target at face value. I did not attempt here to code for embedded layers of appraisal. Rather, if wording pointed towards the features of the developing text, then I coded that section as an instance of appreciation, even if it included a directive that might be assessed as judgment. Unless there were clearly multiple instances of inscribed attitude evaluations, I treated multi-clausal comments as single units in terms of coding. These decisions made the preliminary analysis of my data possible, although, as I will discuss, a more nuanced and targeted study is warranted. In looking at results, the first thing I note is that tokens of negative attitude predominate. Nearly 85% of all tokens of attitude were negative, and the object of appraisal was most often developing text at 83% of the total. Given the purpose of feedback at this stage of the writing process, as well as parameters I discussed above for coding, these patterns make sense. The goal of this feedback is to improve the writing at hand and develop writing habit and skills for long-term use. The only two areas where there were more positive than negative tokens were in the area of happiness and quality, where there were 75 positive instances to only 29 negative. The quality occurrences were often in the summative evaluations with comments such as strong draft. And of course, tokens of attitude may carry a negative load, but this does not imply that the feedback is harsh or necessarily negative in tone. Many of the negative tokens occur as questions, and many are modalized or modulated. Moreover, I did not look at the graduation in force for this initial analysis, and it is clear that such analysis is warranted, as force reducers, such as somewhat, a bit, perhaps, and potentially, occur throughout the feedback. In taking a closer look at tokens of affect appraisal, I would note the predominance of negative satisfaction, realized primarily as confusion or lack of understanding from the reader's point of view, including statements such as, I'm a bit confused, I don't follow, I'm not sure what this means. Questions such as, could you tell me more about it, or could you give us a such as here, also fall into that category. A review of tokens of appreciation illustrate that concerns about composition predominate, with standards leading balance and complexity of the three subcategories within composition. Given that initial drafts are meant to center the thesis, content, and developing structure of the text, the prevalence of tokens related to standards was surprising and at first concerning to me. Note, however, the relatively large number of tokens containing imperatives. As discussed before, such imperatives remind students of assignment requirements and expectations, what I call the backwards look, but they also remind them of remaining tasks related to editing and proofreading. The number of negative tokens here focusing on standards may reflect simply the shift in focus from content and organization towards revising, editing, polishing, and proofreading as the students continue to finish their writing process. There are many other features in this data that I could point to. There's simply not time for the discussion here. Analyzing patterns of appraisal, specifically attitude, in my feedback proved to be far more daunting. Approaching feedback through fresh eyes after a period of nearly 2 years, I found that what I thought was obvious and perfectly clear for my students wasn't. The difficulties I faced in organizing the data and coding it reflect challenges that students must negotiate in order to make sense of my comments and apply those comments strategically. Their failure to do so, when that occurs, may be as much or more a function of the format of their feedback, the format of the feedback, rather than the student's willingness or ability. And negotiation is a key word here. As Thompson 2014 points out, tokens of appraisal rely on the assumption that the addressee will recognize and accept that the experiential meanings expressed lead naturally to a particular evaluation. In short, as he concludes, appraisal is a profoundly interpersonal form of meaning making. And that is the problem for my study. The student's interpretation of my comments is missing. My study cannot tell me how my students perceive the evaluation inherent in my comments. I may choose to code an imperative such as, remember to provide a signal phrase for your quote as a token of negative appreciation, but my students may perceive this as a token of negative judgment. I may punctuate that same reminder with an exclamation point to underscore the importance of documentation in the final draft, but my first-year writing students may interpret the fourth of that exclamation point as anger from me. It is clear that I need to bring student voices into the analysis. And that is exactly what I'm doing with these reformulated research questions as I move into a second phase. And as an initial step, I am currently talking to my students, asking them 4 simple questions as we discuss feedback. What did you look at first when you got the feedback? What do you hear when you read a particular comment? For which comment do you need more explanation? And based on these comments, what will you do when you begin to revise? My hope is that these questions will yield insight into students' perceptions of my feedback. At the same time, I am working with advanced writers this semester to design surveys that will help me determine how changes in lexical choice, mood, modulation, modalization, and punctuation impact student reception of written feedback. I'll be working with these students to design, administer, and understand results of these surveys. About 10 years ago, I had a student with significant problems in clarity. Her writing was riddled with vague and general statements, and issues with pronoun reference often left me, her reader, in complete confusion. During a conference, I encouraged her, but I also asked her dozens of questions. What does this mean? I don't follow here. Can you explain it to me? The conference was upbeat, and she seemed very eager to help me make sense of her ideas. But when she submitted the final draft, there were few, if any, changes, and I was flummoxed by the lack of revision. She earned a low grade for the paper, and I commented with the grade that I gave that she had not done anything to address problems in clarity that we talked about in our conference. She came by to see me a week later, very angry, and she said to me, "You seemed to like my paper. You were interested in it, and you never said it wasn't clear. You never said I had problems with clarity." I had assumed that the barrage of questions and my statements of confusion would make the lack of clarity obvious, but for that writer, it was not obvious. As we negotiate evaluation with our students, sharing goals of improving the paper at hand and building transferable writing knowledge, we need to ensure that students can make sense of our appraisals. This is paramount. After all, indeed, it is not always obvious. I have references here that I'd be willing to share, and I would love to continue this conversation if any of you would like to contact me. Thank you very much.